First, I'd like to explain some of the terminology on this slide. It talks about language and math. It's really focusing on language experience. And there's two kinds of language. There's sign language and spoken language. Also, integral to our research is the time a person is exposed to language, and we're focusing on deaf and hard of hearing. And I will be signing deaf from here on out through the presentation, but from here on out through the presentation, I mean to include deaf and hard of hearing people. Most people think that languages and math, the sciences, are very separate because math involves symbols and you do not need to be literate in a language to read math. However, we have found that there is a prevalent linguistic foundation in the literacy of someone acquiring math literacy. And so through my research and the projects that I've been involved in, we've been able to show this. Also on the slide is the phrase number concepts. I will be talking more about this, but one part of the new project focuses on people ages 3 to 6. So we're not talking about trigonometry or sine or cosine. We're talking about representations of specific quantities. We'll be talking about numbers, and we'll be talking about quantity. Numbers, how they're presented, and in the world, how things appear in quantity, as in how many things. And I will try to be discreet when I'm talking about whether I'm talking about numbers from the mind and the representations of numerical systems that are mind-related versus the organic occurrence of quantity. Let me just talk a little bit about me and how I got involved in my research. If you'd like to hear my entire background and story, come back tomorrow and I'll be talking about that, I believe, at 11 in the morning. Obviously, I wouldn't have been able to embark on this research without the amazing gift that my parents gave me, and that's the gift of sign language. And that is my foundation. I worked 23 years with deaf people in Nicaragua, and I'll talk more about that throughout the presentation, and I'll talk about how that informed the current research project that I'm involved with. My entire body of work is fostering access to language and access to education through language. Basically, young people need access to language and then education. Well, hold on that thought for a minute. It will become clearer later on. So my agenda for today's topic is to talk about the math gap. There is a rich literature that describes math for students and children who are hearing, but there is a dearth of research for students and children who are deaf or hard of hearing. With Nicaragua, there seems to be what we have found, a correlation between literacy and the concept of understanding about math. Many people in the audiences that I present to are often not aware of language deprivation that young deaf people have experienced. I don't have that same issue with this audience. I know you're all quite aware of the language deprivation that most deaf and hard of hearing children face, and especially in Nicaragua. Let me talk about what I mean by the math gap. When given standardized math tests, deaf students' scores are quite a lower number than their hearing counterparts. And it doesn't matter what country that you test children in, the measures are standard and the findings are the same. So that is the gap, which leads me to the second point on the slide. The gap really doesn't show up until later in the educational system. At preschool age, the gap is not that pronounced, but the gap widens as children age and progress through the educational system. And these findings are not limited to just children who use sign language. It's deaf and hard of hearing children who use mechanical aids to help their hearing and spoken language. As I mentioned, there are not many studies that compare deaf populations with hearing populations. However, I did a lit review, and of the findings that we compiled and analyzed, we found that the analysis I did was a meta-analysis. The meta-analysis that I did shows that except for one study, all of the other studies showed that hearing students outperform their deaf counterparts. The last study, which does not show that gap, was a study in which the researchers measured knowledge up to the quantity of the number 4. I believe the ages that who were involved in their research study were children ages 3 to 5, so that was one outlier. Standardized tests are good and what we found at showing the gap, but it doesn't show us the why behind the gap. It doesn't show us the problem that's causing the gap. The standardized tests don't show us those questions, and that's why we decided to set up our project. When we designed our project, we had investigated some of the possible theoretical reasons why we thought that the gap could have come about. Problems with estimation, for example. That has been researched, and that has been found not to be an explanation for why the gap exists for deaf and hard of hearing children. Deaf and hard of hearing children are on par with their hearing peers as far as estimation is concerned. So our focus is looking at number, language, and representations. And so far, except for a very small study done in 1984, there has been no research in this area. I'd like to show you an example of how the children approach solving problems when we're asking about quantity. And this is very basic. You might be wondering why I'm showing the video, and the point is children who are in a language-rich environment in which they have access to language automatically know how to count because they have count lists. Those children who are not immersed in a language-rich environment do not contain count lists and therefore have different ways to approach mathematics. This is in Nicaragua. The researcher is Jessica Suple Sabin. So it's a very simple experimental task. If the person has the tool, if the person has the count list, they fully can develop and automatically answer these simplistic equations that we're giving to them. I'm sure you may not remember how you've acquired your own count list. And maybe for some of you, you remember you started speaking or you started signing. But children can produce numbers up to 10. They can say them by the age of 2. They can produce those actual words. However, the question is, can those same children understand what those number representations equal in quantitative means? And the answer is no. They understand that the word one means one thing, but not until later. And for us, we think one, the quantity of one, is a very simple quantity. However, after children acquire the representation of the words for the numbers, it takes them 6 months to understand the quantity of the number 1, and then it takes another 6 months for them to understand what quantity is represented by the number 2. And people might say, well, children who have signed understand that the sign for 2 equals the quantity for 2, but there's no research to show that. People might think, well, going from 1, then you get to 2, well, going to 3 must be easy. But that's not true as well. Research has shown that it takes until a child who has acquired the representational words for the numbers at the age of 2, it will take them until they're 4.5 years old to understand that the quantity 4 equals the label for 4. And then once they get past 5, and there's debates in literature now, but once children seem to acquire the understanding of the quantity number 4 for the number 4, then they quickly pick up the higher numbers in a count list and understand the quantities that correlate with them. It's important to note that it depends on how the researcher or the language presents the actual word. So for example, in English, if you were to present the word 11, 11 is a word that does not naturally follow 10. However, in the Chinese language, the quantity 11 in the language is represented by 10 plus 1. And so research has shown that children in China acquire the quantity understanding and the correlation for the quantity of 11 to the label 11 much quicker than they do in America. And so looking at sign language, some of the symbols that are used, the sign for 5 would promote the number 5 because there are 5 fingers. But again, we don't have the research on that, and my hypothesis is that that's not true. The reason is because the language has to be a foundation for the person to understand the concept, and that's why I hypothesize that that's just signing the number 5 does not automatically instill the quantity correlation within the person learning the language. So it's no surprise, children develop their math literacy from a language-rich environment, which often includes their parents, except if you're talking about quantities above 4. Quantities above 4, and I will show you, really depends on language more than being able to imagine what the quantities look like, quantities of 1, 2, or 3. I'd like to talk about the theory behind my hypothesis. There are 3 systems for showing quantities within the world. The 2 lower systems do not need any language in order to communicate quantity. Individual peoples and some animals are able to understand quantity without language, and that's called analog magnitude. Parallel individualization is talking about an exact representation. So parallel individualization is representational only for small quantities, but the important period comes between the numbers 3 to 5. Quantities above 4 is where approximation is used rather than exact number representation. Again, this is without linguistic knowledge. So think about a squirrel. Maybe they have a choice between 7 or 8 nuts. They're not going to be able to know which is the larger quantity because it's larger than the quantity 4. They're just looking at the mass of nuts they're seeing organically in their environment, and they're approximating a number. So approximations are never exact, and approximations do not work in a math context.